Yeah, I had trouble. I have a a microphone. I want to make sure it's working. Is it coming in pretty clear?
Oh yeah, it sounds really good.
Good. Okay. How you doing?
Good. Hey Doug, nice to meet you.
Same here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Um, Thanks for agreeing to talk to me about your recent book. That's looks like it's behind you there.
It
It's
is. Yeah, it's
from,
my shameless hyping. I always do it.
hey, that there's no time for fake modesty when you're plugging your stuff. You know, the fact is you wrote this book and it's a very entertaining book, and I encourage all 20 of my listeners, or maybe there'll be twice as many because you're on, Doug. But um, I really enjoyed this book a lot, and I think I had heard about it not too long ago, and a few people had tipped me off on it and said that they thought I would like it, and I love three of the bands out of the four, and then the fourth band. Um, I had to do some reinvestigating, and that's Starz because I had three Starz albums when I was a kid, and I remember having them, and it was the first three, and I hadn't really listened to that stuff in a long time. So the book made me sort of reassess um, Starz as a band, which we'll get into later. But I guess the first thing I was wondering is, have the surviving members of Starz repeatedly thanked you for you shining a light on their band from all that time ago? The surviving members of the band.
Uh, they're very grateful, for sure. I've heard from them, and they're very grateful. I mean, it's weird because in the book, they're definitely the underdog. They're the band that never got a lot of respect at the time.
Mhm.
Um, and especially from the other bands of that era. I mean, I have Paul Stanley and Rick Nielsen and Dennis DeYoung from Styx, all you know kind of like dissing them.
Right.
Um, and I think that was a little bit of an eye opener for some of the guys. But yeah, no, I've heard from them, and they're really grateful that this book has renewed interest in the band. I mean, they didn't sell a lot of records back in the '70s. And I don't think they're selling records now either, or it really wouldn't matter. But I think the fact that they're getting attention, and people like you are creating pieces of art and sharing it socially, and like basically building this momentum around this band that is pretty much forgotten, I think, speaks to the power of the book.
Yeah, yeah. Their story definitely. I was kind of surprised too because I didn't know their origins. And um, first, I went back and listened to at least the first three records. I haven't got to Coliseum Rock yet, but what struck me was that the first record, even at a curious face value listen, it's a good record. Production's really good. Jack Douglas, the engineer, Jay Messina. I was kind of surprised to read that the other people in the book thought of them as being posers, I guess, because they were formed together really quickly and because they came from, two bands that actually had success that weren't hard rock bands. But, I think about that and then I think, well, Kiss came from Wicked Lester, and, like what's really ultimately the difference,
I think that there was a suspicion that these guys were, like you said, posers, because they didn't really pay. They paid their dues in other bands, but they didn't pay their dues as stars because they were
Right.
signed by Bill Aucoin, who had Kiss as his main band. They were the second band signed to his management firm, and right away they were opening for bands like for opening for ZZ Top and Peter Frampton and Roxy Music and all of these bigger bands because Bill was able to leverage Kiss, Kiss's success. And Stars never really came up in the kind of the grassroots dive bar circuit, and all the other bands in the book did. So they were looked upon as with a little bit of suspicion. Whether it was earned, I mean, you could argue that it was earned because they, not many people knew that they came from these other bands like Stories and Looking Glass, and they intentionally did not want people to know that, just as you said, because these were bands that were not hard rock bands. They were frankly soft rock bands, and it would kind of ruin, it would spoil the cred, it would spoil their cred to know that these guys came from these kind of, wimpy bands that I happen to love.
I remember both bands. I remember both their songs. I remember Louis, Brother Louis, and just thinking, what a weird, what is he singing about? That's weird. And then I saw a video of them like not too long ago, and like the singer looks, you live in Toronto?
I live in Toronto, yeah.
Well, the singer looks just like Joe Flaherty from SCTV in a way. Like, just fucking like Joe Flaherty. And then a couple of the other guys, not Richie Rano, because I think it was before his time, definitely looked like rock and roll guys, whatever. But, and of course, Brandy, I remember that song. So I guess I understand that, but I still think that's kind of funny, and that would be like such an issue because the music's just fine. I mean,
yeah.
It's as good as well, maybe not. No, it's relatively as good as the rest of the mid '70s hard rock output. But anyway, I was kind of wondering how long did it take for you to write this book? How did it even come to be? Like, what were the circumstances of you actually writing this book, deciding you were going to do it, and then trying to find somebody that believed in it? How long was the process?
Well, I guess it was around 13 years ago. I had the idea, and I got the idea because I had always wanted to write a book. I think I had just left Spin magazine, where I was editor-in-chief for a few years, and I wanted to come up with a project that I thought could possibly sell and sort of tackle, hard rock in a way that hadn't been tackled before in a book. I mean, there are a lot of books about hard rock out there. There aren't a lot of really, really good books about hard rock out there, and that takes it seriously and with a lot of research, and I wanted to do something. And I was playing the Gene Simmons solo album from '78, and I was perusing the credits, and I realized that, artists from 3 other bands played on that record, or more than 3 other bands, but 3 crucial bands. Richie Rano from Starz, Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick, and Joe Perry from Aerosmith played on that record as well. And I thought that would be a really cool like launching point for a book to talk about how these bands interrelated, because I knew that, all 4 of the bands are big favorites of mine. I mean, Kiss was the first band I fell in love with. Cheap Trick is my all-time favorite band. So I wanted to find a way to like tell the story of how these bands were all interconnected. And this is kind of the route I took. That was 13 years ago. Cut to, my life had gone in different directions and I was too busy to write a proposal. Finally, I took the time, I wrote a proposal, shopped it around to some agents. One of them, I had a number of them were interested. One of them really, really was interested. And I went with him, this guy named Roger Freet, and he was able to sell it to, it was originally Da Capo Publishing, which changed over to Hachette when Hachette bought Da Capo. And they basically changed the name, absorbed all the Da Capo books, and now they're released as Hachette books. So that's kind of the origin. And it's funny because earlier you said that you had the Starz records when you in the '70s. I hadn't really heard them until the early 2000s. I knew of them back in the day in the '70s, but I never paid attention to them. I never bought their records. And it wasn't until I believe it was Rykodisc re-released their albums on CD with extra tracks. That's when I actually finally heard them, and I really, really liked them. So that's kind of how they came into the mix. And there was such a mystery about them because no one really knew what their story was. And I wanted to tell it in sort of conjunction with these other three bands.
Yeah, they became sort of the focal point for me because I'm probably roughly the same age as you, maybe a little older, but I came to age during the 70s. I bought Rock and Roll Over by Kiss when I was like 10 years old. So they're the ones that ruined it for me, I guess. That was like the first rock band I ever heard, and hearing them, they were the gateway band basically. I saw them on not Don Kirshner, on Hollywood. What am I trying to
Paul
say?
Lynn's Halloween special.
Halloween special. Sorry,
Yes.
I don't know what's going on. And that was my mid 70s Beatles, like seeing the Beatles and Ed Sullivan moment. And a lot of people, I know I've talked to a lot of people that kind of that was their like the Melvins guys. I know
Dale told me that. Dale Crover told me that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was that. And then Cheap Trick came, and right away you could tell Cheap Trick was the better band. They were smarter. They were drawing on influences that I would have not discovered for quite a while, like The Move and Roy Wood and stuff like that. And so I already knew I loved Cheap Trick. I think I bought In Color and then the first record after they came out. And that was, I loved Kiss and I still was with them, but man, Cheap Trick were, and Kiss took Cheap Trick out. And Aerosmith, I loved Aerosmith too. And so I had all that stuff, and I ended up buying the Starz records. But my version of Starz, as far as like a band, and I know you've heard this before, but they're like almost the same in terms of how they were pushed to be this big band, and it just didn't quite work out. Like you talk to some people and they love Angel or they love Starz. You talk to some other people and they don't know anything about either band, or they know that Angel has the logo that looks really funny and that Frank Zappa made fun of him years ago, and that's what people know about Angel and Punky Meadows. But so that I had all that stuff, but if you take out Starz and put in Angel, that's kind of, I listened to Angel as much as the other three bands. Nobody was there to tell me that they weren't as good or as cool as those other bands, and I'm sure Starz had the same sort of thing. But yeah, definitely Starz took, in your book, they're like they took the lead, because everyone knows about Kiss. And I think there was one Cheap Trick book that came out like 20 or 25 years ago, called Reputation is a Fragile Thing. And do you have that? Or
I do. But and there's also a new one coming out on June 21st. I'll put a plug in. It's actually the same day my book comes out in paperback. There's a book coming out by a guy named Brian Cramp, who hosts a Cheap Trick podcast, who's a co-host of a Cheap Trick podcast. And his book is called This Band Has No Name. Sorry, This Band Has No Past. This Band Has No Past. And it's basically it's a biography of the early days of Cheap Trick. So that's coming out soon.
I'm sold.
Yeah. So am I. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah. I was such an innocent child that when I bought the first Cheap Trick record and read those bogus liner notes, I thought they were serious. I was like, oh, that's weird. Why do these guys look like that?
So, it's funny you say that, because so did one of the heads of publicity at Epic when I interviewed this woman, Susan Blonde, about Cheap Trick and about being their publicist. I'd mentioned to her that, the guys had made up a lot that was in the bio, like, Bunny Carlos's real name is Bunizuela Carlos, and his parents were instrumental in building the Panama Canal. I mean, just some like bogus bullshit. And she was like, I thought that was true. This is the woman who was heading up the publicity department. She thought it was true. And I burst her bubble, and I thought that was pretty funny.
That's awesome. The book's been out for like a year and a half, 2 years now.
It's been out a little over a year. It came out December 2019.
How has the reaction been to it?
It's been good. I mean, if Amazon reviews or anything. It's very positively reviewed. People who have read it and connected with it have really loved it. I'll say that. I mean, I wish it penetrated the rock and roll book world a little deeper. But I'm happy with how, I'm happy with the reaction. I think people have really, people who are into this stuff really like it. And I wrote it for those people. I wrote it for you. I wrote it for people who are obsessed with these bands, and it's a book I wanted to read, so I wrote it.
Yeah, well, you did a really good job, and
thank you.
I thank you for writing the book, because when I was going through the whole thing, it was like it's almost like this guy wrote this book for me, and I'm sure you've heard that before.
I have, and it's so heartening to hear that. Just people are reaching out on Facebook and on Twitter, and just saying how much they love it, and it just hit them in the right spot. They grew up with these bands, and it makes me feel good.
Yeah, and you get to be a part. Like I watched a few other interviews that you did with some of the Kiss obsessed fan base sort of people who are all really nice and stuff like that. And the reaction to the Kiss world seems to be, I would imagine, positive, I guess.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's something that really concerned me, because I know how obsessed Kiss fans are, especially when it comes to minutia and facts and all of that. And I made great strides and took great pains to make sure that this book was airtight. And I had a couple of very, very minor, blips in the book that are going to be corrected for the paperback version, but very minor. But man, it's like to get the response and not to have people bombard me with oh, you messed this up, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that. It made me feel pretty good.
Yeah. The Kiss thing is really interesting because, it took a long time to kind of go back toward the realization that, well, Kiss were a really good band. I don't think anything would have happened to them or for them if they didn't have good music, and I thought their stuff was, especially looking back, they were good songwriters and singers, and they wrote good, catchy, dumb, mid-70s rock songs with inappropriate lyrics for young boys to listen to. And what is this word blow that they keep singing about? What is that? And then,
it's funny because I hear what you're saying, and it really kind of confounds me why there's such vitriol against Kiss. People really hate them, and it's they're not hateable. They're not a hateable band. I mean, like you said, they're good to great musicians who wrote some great catchy songs. There's nothing really objectionable about Kiss, and I think people have this kind of misconception, they're this little kid band and their music sucks. It's no, it's not the case.
Oh, it's actually good music. The little kid angle came later, but what can you do? And the fan base is crazy. It's some of the people that you talk to, they all seem like they're really nice people, but some of them just kind of seem and they're all I'm 56.
I'm 58.
You're 50. Okay. So they all seem like these, the Kiss fans that are in our age bracket that are totally obsessed. I'm not going to say all of them, but some of them just seem like the kind of people that just couldn't get over being picked on when they stuck with Kiss after Dynasty. And it's man, if you think that is bad, try being into punk rock a year or two later. Hey, Devo, faggot. Hey, whippy pig. It's man, you're going to be upset about people not giving you shit for liking Dynasty or En Masse. Try liking Black Flag or anything like that. It's come on, man.
But you're so right. I mean, I've made a point in a couple of interviews of saying that, when you were a Kiss fan in high school in the 70s, the mid to late 70s, you had to defend the band. You had to put up with so much crap by people who are naysayers, and you really had to, go to bat for them. But you mentioned Dynasty. It's that's the record. After Dynasty, everybody jumps off, it seems. I mean, I jumped off right after that was the first time I saw them. They were touring Dynasty
79.
in 79. And that was the first time I ever saw Kiss. And I didn't see them again until they took their makeup off and they were wearing the, you know, the caftans and the neon jumpsuits and all of that. I was like,
The Las Vegas Lion Tamer clothing that they had.
Siegfried and Roy. Exactly. And so I didn't pay attention for the longest time, and then I sort of jumped back on the train when they put the makeup back on in '96, and then I kind of stayed with them since then.
Right. Well, I think their obsessive fan base is part of the reason why I've gotten sucked back into the whole thing, because it's like the band's one thing and they've done a lot and it's really, really interesting and fascinating. But the fan base and the obsessiveness of it, of how devoted they are to it, I think only the Beatles have fans that are that obsessed about it. And for me, there was like too much other stuff coming out that was so good that, you know, like we talked about Cheap Trick and Aerosmith, but, you know, by 1980, it was, you know, I don't know, new wave music and soon to be punk rock. And then Judas Priest Unleashed in the East. I mean, that's a way cooler sounding record to a post Kiss fan in 1979 when it came out than anything, you know, for sure. And then when Kiss did Lick It Up, I bought that album and I thought it was good. And I saw them on that tour. And I gotta say, I've only seen Kiss twice. And the second time I saw them was on their first of many reunion tours with, you know, Ace and Peter. And as much as I would love to say that I thought the reunion show I saw was good, I just can't. You know, it was like, what's that Thomas Wolfe quote? You can't go home again. It was like, it just seemed like two guys that were on the ball and two guys that were flat tires, and they just
wow.
but I mean, I say that with all respect. I don't mean that. I don't know any of those people. I'm not trying to get people, irate Kiss fans, to, you know, suddenly pay attention to me with this or whatever. But that's just what it seemed to me at face value. And then when I saw them on the Lick It Up tour, which is really funny, they were 10 times better as a band, as an actual band, with Vinnie Vincent, who's obviously nuts, and the late Eric Carr. So I just find the fan base fascinating, and yet you were able to take not a tired subject matter, which is Kiss, but just, you know, like you said, there's a lot of Kiss books, and you were able to find stuff in between all these other books that people kind of missed, and then putting Cheap Trick and Aerosmith in there, and then Starz is like, you know, and using the Gene Simmons solo record, the third best solo record, as a meeting point is.
I say second best, but it's okay.
Is your third favorite Paul Stanley's?
No, Paul's my favorite because it's most like a Kiss record, and I think Gene's is the second best. You know, I love Back in the New York Groove on the Ace record. I'm just not a fan of the other stuff, and I maybe listened to Peter's record twice in my lifetime. I just think it's terrible.
I've never listened to Peter Chris's record. My rating would be Paul, Ace, and then Gene. But I like Gene's Beatles tributes on his solo record.
Yeah, well, that's what I think he did a really nice job on that record. I mean, it's bizarre because it's like all over the place and it's kind of goofy, but it's just different. It's experimental. And I want to just go back to something you said earlier that I thought was really interesting. It's like, I was like you in 1980, my aesthetic shifted and I became a total like new wave punk rock kid. And that was where I was headed. And I never, you know, I didn't even, I wouldn't listen to hard rock. I wouldn't listen to metal. I was never a metal fan. I'm still not a metal fan. But
I was a selective metal fan. I never stopped liking what I liked before I heard other stuff. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and you know, I went to the whole punk rock thing, and that was me throughout the 80s. Yeah. And you know, in the 90s, it became like alternative rock and the stuff that was out there. A lot of the British bands I really loved. But now, having written this book, the book really kind of turned me on to listening to more stuff that I kind of missed the first time around. And It's all I play now is 70s hard rock. Like all the stuff I've missed. Like I never paid attention to bands like Nazareth and Deep Purple and Hawkwind and all these bands. And now that's all I play.
Yeah. Well, there's like this huge universe of bands that also put out credible, I guess, rock music that just for whatever reason never even got as far as Stars or Angel. You know, there's tons of bands that music fanatics lord over and love, like, you know, like I guess Sir Lord Baltimore is one of those bands, and nobody knows who they are except for just the nerdiest of nerdy rock music fans, I guess.
But it's funny. They came up in one of my interviews for the book. I was interviewing this guy, Binky Phillips, who was in a band called The Planets in New York. And he was a schoolmate of Paul Stanley. And he actually, if it was fascinating to me, he actually tried out for Starz after they let go of their second guitarist, Brendan Harkin. No, sorry. It was before they hired Richie Rano. Binky had tried out for the band. Anyway, I'd asked him about what was going on in the early 70s New York, like hard rock wise. And he says there was nothing going on in that period. There was Sir Lord Baltimore. There was a band called, I think they were called Loose Shoes or something. They had like one album out, and this is during the Wicked Lester, you know, pre-Kiss era.
71.
Yeah, and he also mentioned this. I think it was him who mentioned this band, the New York Rock and Roll Ensemble. I don't know if you've heard of them. They were more like in the Procol Harum, Left Bank kind of Baroque rock vibe.
Like the Left Bank Baroque harpsichord.
Yeah. There was a little bit of classical mixed in, but they become one of my favorite bands just from hearing about them while researching the book. So, yeah. So it's the book even turned me on to bands I didn't know about, which is what I have to say.
And I think I already read an interview where you said this, but your favorite band out of the four is Cheap Trick. Mm-hmm. So what is it about Cheap Trick that kind of does it for you? And I'm going to ask you about what you think of their wilderness years, but we'll get to that in a second, because every band had wilderness years. So I'm wondering what you think. Who do you think had the best wilderness years?
Okay. Well,
but as far as Cheap Trick, I'm sorry. As far as Cheap Trick goes, what is it about them that just makes them your favorite?
I think that what struck me about them was the look, and that was something that struck me about Kiss as well. Just the appearance. I mean, they looked so bizarre to me. I think I saw their picture before I actually heard them, and I just loved the idea of these two guys who looked nothing like rock stars and two guys who looked exactly like rock stars playing in a band together. And then when I finally heard them, I had heard the first album. I think it was Hot Love. It was Hot Love, the first song I heard by them. And I just loved that song. Someone had played it for me. And then I just loved that they weren't really kind of categorizable. They weren't a new wave band. They weren't really a hard rock or metal band. They were just this weird thing. And, you know, the songs are really bizarre on that first record. They're really dark.
The lyrics are, most of that record sort of matches. It's sort of a brutal sounding record, because I mean it's very tuneful, but there's a lot of it's really brutal. It's sort of my favorite record out of all of theirs, to be honest. Although obviously I like plenty of their other records, but for just impact, that record was so bizarre. And then just to go back and listen to like Daddy Should Have Stayed in High School and all, it's like this is a lot different than singing about, you know, Kiss singing about trying to get a blowjob. This is a lot darker and a lot weirder, but it took years to realize what they were talking about, you know?
Right.
But I'm kind of with you ultimately. I think Cheap Trick's the best band as a whole, ultimately. And they're just a weird, you just can't really say where they belong. You know, that record's almost as important to me as like the Ramones or Sex Pistols albums.
Yeah, and I think with Cheap Trick, their influences were so bizarre because, they loved the Beatles, they loved the Move, especially they loved the Move.
Oh, they love
They
the movie.
love, yeah, they love Slade. They have great taste, but they also, I mean, Rick's a big fan of like British blues and prog and like I said, Procol Harum, and he loved Jeff Beck. I mean, he loved all these bands that wouldn't necessarily go together, and he stole from a lot of them, and he admittedly stole from a lot. You can just listen to their music and say, "Oh, he took that from that song. He took that from that other song." But it works. It works, and it's just genius stuff.
I think so. And, it doesn't hurt having arguably one of, if not the single best rock singer, definitely top 5, Robin Zander, and he's still sounds good. And he's like this method actor kind of singer where it's like he just sings the character of whatever song he's performing, and some of the characters are nasty. Some of them are very sweet and romantic, and the bass sound, Tom Peterson's bass sound, which is just like the Move. And Buddy Carlos, one of the greatest drummers of all time. It was such a good package. And I mean, the other bands are all great, but Cheap Trick, just as a old man talking about them with 30 to 40 years plus listening experience behind them, like how would I rate that now? As that's what I think. And you can tell they really like music a lot. Not like the other guys didn't like music, but these guys seem like they were.
But it's a good point, because when you listen to Kiss, it's harder to pinpoint Kiss's influences, because they also sounded, when they first started, they sounded very unto themselves. And like, I know that Paul and Gene love bands like Free and Humble Pie, but you don't really, you hear maybe a little bit of that in their music, but it sounds like Kiss. It doesn't really sound like anybody else.
Yeah, they were pretty clever about songwriting ways, about what they stole and how they stole, I guess, or how they were inspired, and then how do you rate Aerosmith? Are they like number 4 or number 3?
Out of these 4 bands, they'd be number 4, I think. I mean, I love early Aerosmith.
Yes.
I'm not a huge fan of mid-period Aerosmith.
This mid-period Aerosmith, is that
post Joe Perry, I guess, when Joe left.
You mean Rockin' a Hard Place?
Yeah, and yeah. That's not a big fan. And Night in the Ruts, I thought they were kind of like, after Draw the Line, I kind of fell off them a little bit. I do like a lot of their bombastic, Jerry Bruckheimer shit toward, the more recent stuff. I do like a lot of that. I think some of the songwriting is great. I know they had a lot of help with that stuff, like Desmond Child and Diane Warren and various other people. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a guilty pleasure, but I don't feel guilty about things that give me pleasure. But
right.
there is a certain shame attached to, like, oh, you like that kind of Aerosmith? I'm like, yeah, I mean, I like a good song that's produced well and played well. And I think some of that stuff is really great. So, but I guess I wasn't as into Aerosmith as I was into Kiss and Cheap Trick. But they're a great band, and they will always forever, to me, be a great band.
Yeah, I was really into. I was really a huge fan of Aerosmith, and I was with them. I kept buying their records. I kept buying, like, people talk about Dynasty, but man, Rockin' a Hard Place, for what it is, it's a Joe Perry and Brad Whitford free record, but it's like, I like that record. I hate to say it, I like some of that Pump and Permanent Vacation stuff. I bought all those records as they came out. I even saw them on the Permanent Vacation tour, and I was with them throughout all that stuff, and I think the last record I checked out was Get a Grip. Now, I mean, that's like what, 30 years ago or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
And
It's
so
funny. I saw Aerosmith. I think it was a permanent vacation tour. They played Giant Stadium in New Jersey with Deep Purple and Guns N' Roses opening. So that was pretty awesome. Um,
interesting. When
yeah,
I saw them Dokken open up, and we all just skipped the opener because nobody gave a shit about Dokken, and then we just showed up, and they again. I'm like, I
I
hope
went
I'm
to
not
that
putting.
tour as well.
You went to that tour as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Well, I wish I could sit here and go, man, they were great. But I'm setting up this theme where like I'm sounding really critical about seeing some of my favorite bands, but my favorite member of Aerosmith is Brad Whitford, and he was the only person that seemed like he kind of knew what he was doing. And Tom Hamilton. That's all I remember about the show. So it's kind of weird. The one person I liked the best was the one person that actually seemed like he kind of knew he was on stage and knew he was playing, and they had to sound good and that kind of thing. And he kind of held up his end of the bargain. Okay, so now here's something I have to ask you about, which is the wilderness years of all these bands. So I'll set up the wilderness years question, and then you tell me what you think. I think Kiss's wilderness years are obviously after Dynasty. I makeup, no makeup, after Lick It Up, I just didn't really pay attention to them at all. Like all the hair metal period, there's a song here or there that I thought was pretty good, but I consider that, even though that was a very successful period for them, and there's people that love Makeupless Kiss, I consider that their wilderness period. But when they came back with Ace and Peter, they still didn't, they didn't really make any records. I don't think that they made Psycho Circus, right? I've never even heard that record. So anyway, I would consider that their wilderness years. Cheap Trick, wilderness years are when Tom Peterson quits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he comes back. But I'm of the opinion that the wilderness years without Tom Peterson are way better than the couple records they made when he came back, Lap of Luxury and Busted. I think those records, and Woke Up with a Monster.
You're absolutely right.
I actually think The Doctor is a cool record. It's really weird sounding. It's like, what the fuck are these guys going for? And that's supposed to be their absolute rock bottom in their wilderness years. But I think the three records they made when Tom came back really blow. And it was only when they released the self-titled record, the second self-titled record, where, okay, they have it back. And they've been good ever since. So that's my wilderness period for them. And then Aerosmith, well, we already talked about their wilderness period. So as a listener, and since you wrote this book about these bands, which band had the most appealing wilderness years segment of their careers for you?
My first reaction would be Cheap Trick by a mile. Exactly how you phrased it. I thought that after Tom left, the records became interesting, not great, but really interesting. And every one of them had great stuff on it.
I agree.
And they went from Tom Werman, who produced, the second album, In Color, Heaven Tonight, and Dream Police. They went from him to George Martin, who produced All Shook Up, which is, I don't think is a great record. And that's the one where Tom didn't even finish that record. He had already checked out of the band by then. And then they went to Roy Thomas Baker and Todd Rundgren, and they were making these really interesting records under, from what Bunny told me, kind of bizarre, circumstances. They weren't getting a lot of money from the label. The label wasn't promoting them, and all of this nonsense. But some of those records have great stuff on it. And you mentioned The Doctor, and The Doctor, when I first heard it, I absolutely hated it. I hated how it sounded, because it has a big, boomy, clangy, 80s production. It doesn't sound like a Cheap Trick record.
all the keyboards and
all the
stuff.
keyboards and like and just like it's an oppressive record. I describe it in the book as being in an MRI machine operated by the ape men of 2001 with the bones banging on the MRI machine, and that's what it sounds like.
All right, but some of those songs are really good.
Some of the songs are great, and if they could like re-record that record with like just a producer who can just like turn it down a little bit, I mean, it would be a brilliant record.
I agree.
And on the opposite end, they did Next Position Please with Todd Rundgren, which I think has some of their greatest songs on it. But I'm not a fan. I love Todd Rundgren. I'm not a fan of that production. I think it's too weak. It's too tinny.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very good. And I like Todd Rundgren a lot too. But,
yeah, and a friend of mine sent me someone, I believe it was a guy from this band called the Shazam, if I'm not mistaken. He re-recorded the guitar and overdubbed some of Next Position Please with like these beefy, powerful rock guitars, and it sounds really good. So yeah. I mean, those records would sound great with a beefier sound to it.
Yeah, and every one of those records has at least one or two songs that are as good as anything they've ever done. But you just gotta step through, like not Next Position Please. The one I can never remember that has Tonight It's You.
Standing on the Edge that Jack Douglas produced, and that's a perfect example of a record from that period, which is as good as their first records. I love that album, and Tonight It's You is one of their best songs, one of my favorite songs of theirs.
Great song, yeah.
But yeah, you're right about when Tom came back and they did Lap of Luxury and Busted, which are two pretty weak records, and even Woke Up with a Monster, which was their kind of supposed to be their second act, because they were off of Epic Records. They were signed to Warner Brothers. It's half a good record. The first side's pretty good. The second side is really kind of lame. And then they came back in '97 with that self-titled record. And you're right, that's when they kind of stripped everything back again, started writing real songs, and they've been on a roll ever since. I mean, they've been releasing a lot of records.
Yeah, and they're all good. I mean, it's still kind of bizarre to think about. Again, I don't know any of these people, and I always thought Buddy Carlos, of anybody, would have a great book in him to write.
He does. I'm sure he does. Yeah.
Because he's very forthcoming and stuff. But man, it's, as a fan, it's like almost shocking and sad to think that those two guys ended up having some. Sometimes people just end up not liking each other after a while. So it's kind of like, oh, what a bummer. One of the greatest singers of rock music and one of the best drummers can't get along. That's really too bad. And they're fine now with Dax, of course, and those records are good too. But and I certainly give it to them for sure. But it's still just, the drummer's always the first to go in that scenario anyway. Like when you get to be 7 years old, no matter how good you can still play, the drummer's always the first to go. That's just how it is, But yeah.
So just to go back to the fallow period. So Kiss was the band that after Dynasty I ignored pretty much, and I had heard some of the singles like Lick It Up and Heaven's on Fire, and I liked them, but I never bought the records, never sought them out, never really cared. But writing this book, I went back and I felt obligated to play a lot of the stuff that I missed. And I'll tell you that the two records that I feel terrible for sleeping on are Unmasked, which is their kind of power pop new wave record, which has some really good songs on it. And they hate it. They hate that record. It's always the album that the band hates that has some really interesting stuff on it that fans like.
Sure.
And that's one. And the other one is Revenge, which I slept on totally. And when I heard that record, I was like, wow, this is a really good Kiss record. There's some good songs on that record for sure. Yeah. And Gene Simmons finally found a character he could sort of be that wasn't his original character, that he could play real well. The
kind of evil looking kind of guy with the trench coat.
Mhm.
What do you think of that Carnival of Souls stuff?
It's not terrible. I mean, people were giving him shit for like jumping on the grunge bandwagon, but you know, it's a credible grunge simulation. It's not quite grunge. It's
Right.
Kiss's version of grunge, but the songs aren't terrible. That, you know, I discovered in my research that's mostly a Bruce Kulick record. He was instrumental in putting that together. He co-wrote most of the songs on it. He told me he was very upset when that record was shelved, because the reunion tour was coming up. So they didn't want to have this conflicting, you know, record coming out while the reunion was happening. And then all of these like crappy 15th generation dubs were going around of that record. And he was very upset that it wasn't the record that they had recorded. It was a terrible copy of it. But when that record finally came out, you know, it didn't do much, and I didn't pay attention. I didn't pay attention, and then, you know, I finally heard it, and I was like, "This is not terrible. It's okay." Yeah,
Mhm.
nothing. I mean, I'm never going to play it again, but it's okay.
That's kind of my reaction. Like this is all right. It seems kind of bandwagon-esque jumping, and it's kind of weird to hear Kiss pretend to be miserable or whatever.
It's better than Psycho Circus, in
I've,
my opinion, which
I've
is
never,
pretty unlistenable.
but I'm sure it's terrible. I think I listened to one of the records they did with their recent lineup where they were trying to really sound like 70s Kiss, and it was pretty good.
Sonic Boom,
That was the
followed
one.
by Monster, and I think Sonic Boom is their best record since Love Gun. I'm a huge Love Gun fan. That's my favorite Kiss record. But Sonic Boom is a really good record. The next one, Monster, I didn't really care for too much, but yeah, I will go to bat for Sonic Boom.
Okay, I'll have to check that out. Did you get any feedback from some of the people that you weren't able to interview and some of the bands that you talked about at all?
Did I get feedback? I got feedback from Bunny Carlos, who loved the book. I heard, you know, Rick Nielsen's kind of a funny, kind of cranky guy, and it took a lot of effort to actually get him to be interviewed for the book. I think he's very kind of suspicious of people writing books that are unauthorized. And anyway, so I heard secondhand that or I didn't hear secondhand. I actually read a quote from him saying that he had read a bit of the book and he liked what he read. So I was happy to hear that. I did read a comment from Jack Douglas, the producer who worked with 3 of these 4 bands, and I had tried really hard to get him for the book, but he didn't respond to messages on Facebook, and I went through various other people who said he's not interested in talking with you. I went through his publicist, who said that he declined, and then I was on a Facebook thread. I think it was on a Starz page, and it was a piece about the book, and he said on this thread, Joe Perry and I are reading this book right now. I have some issues with it. I wish he would have talked to me. I'm like, dude, you had ample opportunity to talk about, to talk for this book, and you declined. And I actually wrote that. I said, just to clear, just to be really clear, I attempted to get you in this book and you declined. So whatever complaints you may have, it's like,
it's your fault. Dude, you could have given me some time. It's like you can't complain about it now. You had the opportunity. Exactly. I have a few things to say. Well, I'm sure plenty of people would have a few things to say, but at the same time, it's like if you gave them an opportunity, I don't know. Well, I enjoyed it. I continue to enjoy it. I imagine this book must have led to you doing something in the future that you probably can't tell me about at this point, but I'm sure you got
Not
something.
yet. I have a couple of things I'm pursuing. So yeah, we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, cool, man. Well, I really enjoyed. I think I went through all the stuff I wrote down. My only, it's not even a beef. My only thing is, I just wish Punky Meadows had played on Gene Simmons' solo record. That was the case.
But it's funny because a lot of people confuse Starz with Angel.
How can you possibly confuse Angel with like five guys that look like Jacqueline Bisset or Charlie's Angels?
I know, but people think that Angel were also managed by Bill O'Coin, but they weren't. They were on Casablanca, and Gene was instrumental in getting them signed to Casablanca. But Angel has ties. They could have been in the book, to be honest with you, because they have ties with Kiss, they have ties with Cheap Trick,
Yes.
and they have ties with Starz, and they have ties with Aerosmith. So yeah, they could have been the fifth band in this book. To be honest with you, I mean, I'm not a huge Angels fan. I like them, and I've seen them since they kind of regrouped with Frank and Punky and some other guys, and they're really good. They actually toured with Starz recently in the past few years, and they were really solid. They're a bit histrionic for my taste, and a bit a bit pompy. I'm not a huge fan of that kind of like pomp with the cheesy keyboards and stuff, but I like them. I got their CD box set, and I got a bunch of their records on vinyl. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I liked them as much as I liked anything else, and it was only years later when I was told about what a failure they were, or how they were lame or whatever. And if I had dug a little bit deeper into those Starz records, they could have joined Angel in my listening experience. I know Eddie Trunk's a big fan of both. So,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. This book made me just obsess over all the stuff I loved as a kid. I mean, it really reads like, I don't know. It just kind of like Eddie Trunk loved this book, and that's about the most glowing, the most glowing compliment as far as somebody that should like this book.
I have to say, I did a long podcast interview with Eddie. Actually, no, it wasn't a podcast. It was his actual radio show, a live interview. And he's in the book. I had interviewed him for the books. I knew he was a huge fan of these bands. But, since I did the interview and he was gushing about how much he liked the book, he had mentioned the book a number of times just in various contexts during his show. And every time he did, I noticed on Amazon, you can see on Amazon how your book is doing like hour by hour. And I saw the book sales rose pretty much every time I heard that Eddie mentioned my book on his show. People started buying the book. So I love his support, and I appreciate all that he's done to help get the word out.
But anyway, thank you so much, Doug. It was an absolute pleasure for me to run my mouth about my 70s rock heroes. Thanks for writing this book. Thanks for agreeing to talk to me. I definitely appreciate it.